Welcome to another episode of The Communicative Leader. I'm your host, Dr. Leah O. We often hear that life isn't fair, and for too long, we've allowed that sentiment to bleed into our organizational cultures. We check the boxes on DE&I and we talk about engagement, but beneath the surface, there is often a hidden layer of unwritten rules, a social contract that, when broken, it leads to disengagement, quiet quitting, and high turnover. Today's guest argues that fairness isn't just a moral idea, it's a strategic imperative and the foundation of all healthy workplace communication. Joining us is Hanna Hasl-Kelchner, an MBA, JD, and award-winning author of the new book, Seeking Fairness at Work, Creating the New Code of Greater Employee Engagement, Retention, and Satisfaction. Hanna bridges the worlds of law, business, and social psychology to help leaders move past surface-level fairness and actually address the toxic norms that drive people out the door. In today's episode, we're diving into fairness factors, 5 workplace norms that betray trust, and how you can move from kind of this mechanical management to a culture of genuine accountability. Let's dive in and have some fun. Hello and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Hanna, thank you for joining us today on The Communicative Leader. I'm really excited to learn more about your work. And one thing that I love that you do is you often compare workplace fairness to the way children ask, how do you play on the playground? So for the leader who thinks their workplace is already fair because they follow the law, what are they missing about unwritten rules?
Well, it's about more than just following the law. It's about the relationship. And there could be unwritten rules that people don't know about, which is why when I talk about, children, it's funny that you mentioned that. They're very upfront about wanting to know, how do you play? And if somebody doesn't give them the right information, you'll hear people say cheater really quick. And when they get really annoyed, they'll take their ball and go home. In the workplace, we can't be quite so blunt.
Yep.
We'll get get fired, but that doesn't mean we're not thinking it, because deep down inside, we understand when we haven't been treated fairly. I mean, it's very, very innate. And so it's those unwritten rules that really do define workplace culture. And it's more than just about the law, because ethics, for example, takes it to a whole nother level, and not everything that is unethical is illegal. And so there's a whole another sphere that can be unfair.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. I think people are really savvy, even if they're not aware of these rules. The unwritten ones we recognize when we are getting less, or maybe we're getting more work than others. But we're pretty good at kind of keeping our eye and figuring out what we see as being equitable.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And when we see someone being treated unfairly, even if it's not us, our little antenna goes up, and we're like, why? And could I be next? And can I trust, this relationship? And so it has kind of a spiraling effect that people need to be aware of.
Yeah. That's interesting. That was part of my dissertation work a million years ago.
Oh.
I study leader-member relationships, but I did an experiment. We were looking to see if we manipulated performance evaluations. And in some cases, we'd hear this fictional peer did really well, but then we look at their performance evaluation from the shared leader, and it didn't match this output. And people spoke up. People were it was the same level of frustration if I saw that you were treating it unfairly as if I myself were being treated unfairly.
Yeah, recognition is really one of those, it's a really big basket.
Yeah.
But it falls into that unwritten rule category, how people are recognized directly, indirectly. And it's not just what leaders say, it can be their body language, whether somebody is acknowledged when they walk in the room or walk down the hall, or whether they're just ignored.
Yes.
So it's important.
Yeah. And that leads us to this idea of engagement. And I know that we see trillions of dollars lost to disengagement globally on an annual basis. And Hanna, I'm wondering, why do these traditional methods of improving behavior or these culture initiatives, why do they usually fail to address that core issue of fairness?
Well, to put it bluntly, because they're half-baked.
Mhm.
To
Yep.
me, it's an incomplete
Mhm.
solution. It's like trying to bake a cake with 2 ingredients when you really need 5.
Okay.
And so you're not gonna get the result, and then, the
Mhm.
organization gets frustrated and like, "Oh, this doesn't work," and they just go back to the default, and
Mhm.
nobody's happy. And if anything, the employees are frustrated, like, yeah, they talk a good game, but they don't mean it because, the leadership is disconnected, as you said,
Mhm.
from the
Yep.
employees and what's really, really needed. And if I can boil it down, I'd say they need to stop treating it as a transaction and
Yep.
treat it more as a
Mhm.
social contract, as these are
Mhm.
people
Yeah.
and people have
Yep.
human needs. People have
Yep.
human needs. And when they're not met, then things are not as strong as they could be.
Exactly. Exactly. I want to learn more about the 5 betrayals. So I know your research identifies 5 common workplace norms that betray fairness.
Yeah.
In your experience, what is one of these hidden norms that leaders unknowingly reinforce that damages relationships or chemistry of teams?
Well, I think there are 2 categories,
Mhm.
really. Most of it boils down into poor conflict management. People
Mhm.
don't like conflict, and I understand it. It's
Yep.
awkward. If you have
Mhm.
to confront somebody, oh my God, they may have an emotional breakdown.
Yep.
They may cry, they may yell, they may scream. I mean,
Mhm.
well, what do you do? And so
Yep.
people avoid it. And the thing is, when you avoid it, it gets worse because the
Mhm.
underlying issue hasn't been
Yeah.
addressed. It hasn't been
Mhm.
resolved. And so it just creates more frustration and pushes people further apart instead of bringing them together. I
Mhm.
think there's just never enough we can learn about how to manage conflict, how to recognize it before
Mhm.
it metastasizes and
Yep.
becomes impossible. So I think that
Mhm.
is really important because the other issue that goes hand in hand with that is accountability. And
Mhm.
it's not just something that should roll downhill, it also rolls uphill. Accountability is a two-way
Yeah.
street. To be able to
Yeah.
say, hopefully in a safe environment, we've got a problem. You're not giving me the support I need. You're,
Mhm.
talking down to me in front of my reports. So now
Mhm.
I'm losing credibility. You say one thing, then you do another. I mean, to be able to have those kind of difficult
Mhm.
conversations in a safe space.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to self awareness. And I know that, Hannah, one of your pillars is rebuilding trust with more self awareness. And I'm wondering from a communication perspective, how does a leader's lack of awareness, maybe it's about their own power dynamics, maybe it's about the way that they verbally communicate, as you mentioned before, maybe they are not good at acknowledging their team members when they come in. How does all of that lack of awareness end up impacting the environment in terms of fairness or unfairness from an employee perspective?
Well, I think awareness, there's different levels of awareness, and
Mhm.
self-awareness is certainly huge, and how people present themselves.
Mhm.
Do they come across as bringing energy in the room that's warm and open, or we're having
Mhm.
a meeting and this is the agenda and boom, 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 we go down the list and
Yep.
I do all the talking, and that creates a different type of energy in the room than,
Mhm.
folks, we got a problem. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know. What do you think, Dr. O?
Yeah.
Tell me, what's your perspective? How does it look
Mhm.
from where you sit? Because, you in the
Yeah.
organization and in the team responsibilities, you have a different perspective, and that's okay.
Mhm.
And you can do that kind of joint problem solving. So, lack of awareness, self awareness, especially when it comes to meeting management, I mean, that can tell you huge
Mhm.
things about an organization, really
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to go back to that accountability as a two-way street. And
Yeah.
so I know that you talk about making genuine accountability as a cornerstone. I think for many organizations, many employees, they feel like accountability is kind of wheeled around like a threat.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, how can a leader communicate accountability in a way that feels culturally safe rather than punishment or a threat of punishment?
Well, as you mentioned, the idea of accountability is a two-way street. If
Mhm.
you want a performance from your employees at a top level, then they need to have the right information. They need to have access to the right resources and a
Mhm.
little insight into like the timeline and what's behind it all
Mhm.
so that they can perform to the right level. And maybe you think you've told them XYZ, but
Yep.
they don't know. And they're like, how am I
Mhm.
supposed to know? It's not in the air.
Yep.
I can't breathe it.
Mhm.
And so sometimes just asking the question, how can I help you? What do
Mm.
you need from me to be
Yep.
successful? And see what the answer is. And if you want to get even more granular, say, well, how did it go this week? What was your biggest challenge?
Yeah.
And this, it takes the pressure off of you, but you might find a bottleneck about communication between departments or
Yeah.
between somebody on the outside and the inside that maybe you can help smooth over and facilitate it so that the next time things go better and they're like, yeah, she has my back.
Yeah.
Exactly. I can go to them for help, right? So I think that would assist that.
I think so many people underestimate the power of asking questions.
Yes, and they may be afraid to ask questions, especially if they're in a leadership position. Too often there's an assumption that they're supposed to have all the answers.
I still remember, I think it was my first master's class. We were just being obnoxious, brand new MA students, and peppering this professor with questions. And then there was one point, and he had all these answers. And then someone's like, what if you don't know? He's like, I will tell you I don't know. And I will look it up for their next meeting. And it was
There you go.
just so simple and so profound. And it had never occurred to me that the professor might not have the answer.
Right.
And it's just really stuck with me, like decades later.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a great way to handle it, to say, we don't know. This is what we know. This is
Mhm.
what we don't know. And here's how we have to find out about it. And if anybody
Yeah,
else has ideas, just jump in. What's the quick way to do it? And AI
exactly.
is not the answer.
This question in preparing made me think of being a child, and now, as I mentioned, I have littles. This life isn't fair. It isn't fair. That rebuttal. So when you encounter a skeptical executive says, I'm here to hit metrics. I'm not, it's not my job to make sure life feels fair. How do you articulate that tangible ROI of fairness in terms of decision velocity and retention to that skeptical leader?
Well, they're absolutely right that life isn't fair, but
Yep.
that doesn't mean the workplace should be unfair. Number one.
Mhm.
Okay. And I can understand, well, but it is, and that's the way it is.
Yeah.
But here's the leadership challenge. Leaders need to get work done through others. And the more that you can demonstrate fairness through
Mhm.
various ways, the more you grease those wheels. The more you
Mhm.
demonstrate unfairness, the more you throw sand into those gears. So
Yeah.
when it comes down to it, fairness is not charity.
Mhm.
Fairness is smart business. It really is.
Mhm.
You get more done.
Yeah. I really like that idea of leaders getting their work done through others. 'Cause you're right. It really is the nature of the job. And that's why I think some have such a hard time with it.
Well, it puts more on their
Mhm.
back.
Yep.
I mean, redoing somebody else's report,
Mhm.
micromanaging.
Mhm.
It's like, with better delegation, you increase your sphere of influence and get more done.
Mhm.
So.
Yes. Yeah. Let's say we have a titled leader listening and they realize in a conversation, maybe it's in a meeting, what is that kind of pause and pivot they can use to reestablish fairness in the moment if they realize things maybe are a little bit off kilter?
Well, that is a tough question and a very good
Mhm.
one. I think it depends on the nature of the situation. Is it a conversation that's suddenly getting heated and each
Mhm.
side is trying to be right? In which
Mhm.
case, a timeout would be appropriate. Let's rethink this. Let's take some time for the temperature to come
Mhm.
down and revisit the conversation and the issues at a later date. And even if you want to go so far as to say, why don't you write down what you think the issue is and how to solve it? And
Mhm.
I'll do the same. And then you can take the two writings and put them next to each other to see where the disconnect is. And that does it in a little bit more of an objective way than to
Mhm.
have voices escalate and get more heated and maybe start getting personal in a way that
Yeah.
really damages the relationship. So a lot depends
Yeah.
on the situation, but I think the worst case is when it gets kind of out of control.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So kind of knowing when to put the brakes on, hit pause, and maybe reconvene.
Yeah, exactly, at a better
Mhm.
time, because sometimes
Mhm.
the escalation is due to time pressure. I've got another
Yep.
meeting in 10 minutes. Let's get this over with. That kind of
Yes.
energy, which is
Yep.
just like, sure, pour gasoline on it. Let's see. Yeah,
Unfortunately, you're like, "Yep,
yeah.
it's just a
But
Monday."
it's a Monday. But the thing is, though,
Yeah.
think about how disrespectful that is to the other
Yeah,
person, saying, you're not
exactly.
important. This isn't
Yep.
important. I don't care what you think. Boom. And then the
Yeah.
next time, are they going to, offer
Mhm.
suggestions or,
Yeah.
you know, no, they're going to shut down and wait for you to give them the answer because you have the answers,
Exactly.
right? So
Yeah.
if that's what you want, that's fine. but you're
Mhm.
not getting the best out of your people that way.
Yeah,
They'll
yeah.
go someplace where their contribution is respected
Mhm.
and
Yep.
rewarded.
Yeah. I'm wondering, we've talked about elements of your new book, but
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's some other things from the book that were either, really surprising to you in the work or that has really struck you throughout that process.
Well, I think you put your finger on it before when you talk about management awareness and, the leaders that want to hit their metrics because that's what's rewarded.
Mhm.
And I
Yep.
think it's legitimate, it's reasonable,
Mhm.
but if they really want to improve the culture and elevate the performance of all their employees
Mhm.
because they spent a lot of time recruiting them,
Yeah.
hiring them, training them. And if the job wasn't important, it wouldn't exist. Right. So, let's make the most of the talent that's on the payroll. Then
Mhm.
my recommendation and kind of, where all of this leads to is have
Mhm.
the proper incentive structures, not just the
Mhm.
metric of the sales. That's
Mhm.
important, yes, but think about how the sales might increase or the innovation might increase
Mhm.
if you had everybody pulling in the right direction, in the same direction, creating incentive structures that
Mhm.
motivate managers to
Yep.
be more equitable, be more fair, providing the
Mhm.
necessary training so that they can be.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that because then we're living our values, not just posting them on a website and calling it a day, you
Yes,
know?
exactly. It's like, here's what we say, here's what we d and
Never
employees
the
know
2
that
shall
is
meet.
the double
Yeah,
standards and triple
yep,
standards depending on who you are. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Hannah, my 2 final questions. The first part is for our titled leaders, our managers, our supervisors, directors. What is the communication or leadership tip or challenge or piece of advice? And then the second question, the related question is, what do you want to leave employees across all ranks in terms of that tip, challenge, or advice related to leadership or communication?
My, that covers a lot of
Mhm.
ground.
Mhm.
My tip to leaders would
Mhm.
be to take a deep breath and be curious. Ask questions of your employees, all kinds of questions. And at the same time, be as humble as you can because you might not like the answer. And
Mhm.
if you don't, treat it
Yep.
as a learning opportunity and a growth opportunity, either to clarify,
Yep.
why they
Mhm.
have a particular reaction or to make an improvement. Because
Yep.
if they care, they'll tell you. It's when they sit
Yep.
back and they go, I don't know, everything's fine. I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm like, that's when you've got somebody who's just doesn't want to deal with conflict, who doesn't
Yeah.
trust you, and is partially checked out. They may still be doing a great job, but you're not tapping into their full potential.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's a frustration. As far as employees across the board, yes, you may encounter
Mhm.
situations that you feel are unfair, where you don't think you've been treated right. And so my suggestion to that is talk to somebody whose opinion you trust. Have a sounding board. I think it's so important to have that kind of third party, either
Mhm.
validation or reality check,
Mhm.
that says,
Yep.
Hannah, I think you're overreacting. Maybe
Yep.
that's a one-off situation. On the other hand, if it's a
Mhm.
pattern, if it's crossed a legal line, then maybe you
Yeah.
want to consult a lawyer in your locale who specializes in that area, not the
Mhm.
one who did your speeding ticket. Okay. And,
Mhm.
also stay true to your values because
Mhm.
if you keep compromising them, eventually it not only affects your performance because it's harder and harder and harder to keep doing the same job at that high level when you
Mhm.
feel that you've been treated unfairly,
Yep.
when you haven't been recognized, when people are humiliating you and you're still
Mhm.
supposed to have that smile on your face and move forward. It affects your self-esteem to the point where it's even tough to interview for another job when you feel
Mhm.
so beat down.
Yep.
So don't let yourself get to that situation. Keep your resume
Mhm.
updated. If you feel that you've been
Mhm.
treated unfairly, stay true to your values because it'll affect your health. So
Yeah.
that's my suggestion.
Yeah, and it's so helpful when I was listening. Kind of humility under is like an undercurrent of both. And I like that you raise it up, especially with the leader, because you're right. Sometimes we ask questions, we don't get answers that we were hoping for or expecting.
Mhm.
But as you said, to lean into humility, to be humble, like you said, if someone isn't going to share this, there's cost with an employee speaking up and sharing things, particularly about their manager's style. And
Yes.
then I think for our employees too, when you talk about that trusted sounding board, that sometimes we might hear
Right.
maybe this reaction isn't necessarily as damaging as you anticipated. So I think that's so important.
Good. Good. Very good.
Yeah. Well, Hannah, thank you for sharing your time with us. I'm really excited to read your new book. I appreciate that the work that you're doing. And again, thanks for being a guest on The Communicative Leader.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.